"Fly it now, I'll pay the fine." Amelia Madison smirked in front of the entire operations room. Outside on the tarmac, a jet carrying 180 passengers sat waiting to launch straight into a storm that should have closed the runway hours earlier. Mason Carter, the single father in a plain technical jacket, calmly refused to sign the release. Amelia fired him on the spot and approved the flight herself, but before the engines ever reached full thrust, Mason made one phone call. 3 minutes later, air traffic control froze the runway. Federal agents walked through the doors, and Amelia stood frozen as the verdict was read aloud. If you believe calm can outlast power, stay with this story and watch Mason turn everything around. The morning had begun quietly enough at the international airport outside Denver, long before anyone imagined the day would end with federal agents walking across the tarmac. A powerful storm system was building along the flight path to London, and Madison Atlantic Airways Flight 217 was scheduled to carry 180 passengers across it, among them business people, elderly travelers, and families making international connections they had planned for months. Mason arrived at the operations center earlier than anyone else that day, the way he always did before a flight that made him uneasy. 3 things bothered him almost immediately. The weather radar showed a storm cell capable of producing violent turbulence along the exact corridor the aircraft would fly through. A pressure sensor on the aircraft had just been replaced but had never completed its verification flight, and the maintenance log had a gap of more than 4 hours that no one could explain. Connor Blake, the airline's director of operations, insisted the gap was nothing more than a data entry error. He assured everyone the aircraft had already been inspected and was fully airworthy, his voice smooth and certain in the way it always was when he wanted a conversation to end quickly. Mason refused to accept a verbal assurance in place of documentation. He asked for the original technical records and requested that the flight be held until the system could be properly checked. It was a small request, the kind he had made 100 times before, but something in Connor's face told him this time would not be simple. In a brief, quiet moment before the tension of the day took over, Mason received a voice message from his 8-year-old son, Luke. The boy wished his father a good day at work and reminded him they had a phone call planned for that evening. Mason smiled at the message, then slipped the phone back into his pocket. From that point forward, the day belonged entirely to the airline, and Luke would not appear again until the story's quiet final hours. The narration reveals, gently and without dwelling on it, that Mason had once investigated a crash that killed more than 100 people. That disaster had begun with a single line of maintenance data that someone chose to ignore because the airline did not want to fall behind schedule. He remembered standing in a field outside a small Midwestern town at 4 in the morning, holding a flashlight over a scorched piece of fuselage and understanding for the first time that every catastrophe he would ever investigate had begun as an ordinary decision made by an ordinary person who believed, just for a moment, that the rules could bend a little without anyone getting hurt. Since that day, Mason had followed one unbending rule: no flight was ever more important than the people sitting inside it. That conviction was part of why Samuel Hayes had trusted him for nearly 15 years. The 2 men had worked together during Mason's time as a federal investigator, long before Mason left government work to raise his son after his wife's sudden death. Samuel had learned, across dozens of cases, that Mason never exaggerated a threat and never called in a warning simply to protect his own position. When Mason picked up a phone to report a concern, Samuel had come to understand it meant something real was already in motion, and that understanding would matter more than either of them realized before the day was over. Up in the glass-walled conference room overlooking the runway, Amelia Madison was on a call with the board of directors, her voice steady even as the numbers behind her told a different story. Madison Atlantic Airways had just closed its 3rd consecutive losing quarter, and Flight 217 was meant to be the triumphant launch of a new international route, packed with investors and aviation journalists who had been flown in specifically to witness the moment. If the flight were canceled, the consequences would ripple outward fast. The airline stood to lose a partnership contract worth hundreds of millions of dollars. It would owe compensation to every passenger on board. Reporters already circling the story would frame the airline as unfit to operate an international route at all. And the banks currently restructuring the company's enormous debt would lose confidence at the worst possible moment. Connor used the pressure to his advantage, telling Amelia that Mason was overreacting, presenting a report claiming the storm would shift away before the aircraft ever reached the danger zone. Mason pointed out without raising his voice that the report was already more than 40 minutes old. The newest radar data showed the storm wasn't moving east at all. It was widening directly across the flight path. Amelia asked Mason to give her a probability, some number that would tell her how likely it was that something would actually go wrong. Mason answered that aviation safety was never decided by whether a disaster was likely. When an aircraft carried a sensor that had never been verified, a maintenance record with a missing block of hours, and a flight path running straight through dangerous weather, the only responsible answer was to keep it on the ground. Connor mocked him in front of the other executives, calling him a former federal investigator still haunted by tragedies from years earlier, a man who saw catastrophe in every routine delay. Amelia, caught between her operations chief's confidence and her safety director's warning, proposed a compromise: let the aircraft take off, then reroute if the weather worsened. Mason refused. The atmosphere in the room shifted the moment he said no. This was no longer a technical disagreement between colleagues. It had become a direct confrontation between the authority of a chief executive and the legal responsibility of the man whose signature made a flight official. Amelia warned him that if he kept blocking the flight, he would personally bear responsibility for every dollar the delay cost the company. Mason answered without any anger in his voice. Financial losses could always be counted in dollars, he told her. 180 lives could not. Word soon reached the conference room that passengers had already boarded, and the flight crew was waiting on a final decision. At the same moment, a major investor threatened to pull funding entirely if the flight was delayed any further. Connor quietly pressed Amelia to prove she was strong enough to run the company her father had built, framing the entire crisis as a test of her leadership rather than a question of safety. Cornered from every direction, Amelia gave the order to proceed. Mason used his authority as director of flight safety to withhold the internal approval code the flight legally required. Without his signature in the system, the aircraft could not leave the gate. Connor suggested the airline simply accept whatever administrative fine might follow and finish the paperwork later. Amelia looked directly at Mason, allowed a small, cold smile to cross her face, and said the words that would follow her for the rest of the year. "Fly it now, I'll pay the fine." Mason explained as calmly as he could manage that this was not a matter of missing paperwork. If Amelia knowingly allowed an aircraft to operate while an unresolved safety warning was on record, she could be violating federal regulations directly, and if anything went wrong in the air, she could face criminal liability, not simply a fine. Amelia heard the warning as a threat rather than a fact. She ordered security to confiscate his badge, announced his termination effective immediately, and placed Connor in temporary control of the safety department. Connor moved quickly, entering an override approval using his administrative access before anyone could stop him. The cabin door closed. The tow tug began pushing the jet away from the gate. Mason did not shout. He did not try to push past security or beg Amelia to reconsider. He simply picked up his phone and dialed the emergency line for the Federal Aviation Oversight Agency, a number he still knew by heart from his years as an investigator. He confirmed his identity using an investigator credential that remained active in the agency's advisory system even after he had left government work. Then he laid out 3 concerns in plain, unhurried language. The maintenance record showed signs of tampering. A critical sensor had never completed its verification, and airline leadership was knowingly dispatching the aircraft despite an active safety warning. Samuel Hayes, on the other end of the line, asked for evidence. Mason forwarded copies of the data he had quietly saved before his access to the system was revoked, records he had learned long ago never to leave unprotected. As Flight 217 approached the runway, the control tower received an urgent instruction to hold the aircraft at its position. The captain came over the intercom to inform the cabin that they did not yet have clearance to depart. Amelia, still certain this was nothing more than a brief delay, turned to Connor for reassurance. Minutes later, a line of federal vehicles rolled into the operations area. Samuel Hayes stepped out, carrying an emergency inspection order for both the aircraft and the airline's operating records. Samuel informed the room that Flight 217 was grounded until an independent technical inspection could be completed. It was not only that single flight under scrutiny. The federal agency was suspending Madison Atlantic Airways' self-certification privileges entirely, citing clear evidence of interference in the safety approval process. Amelia, furious, accused Mason of exploiting an old relationship with federal officials to take revenge for being fired. Samuel rejected the accusation flatly. He explained that Mason's call had only triggered the review. The technical data transmitted by the aircraft's own systems was what gave the agency legal grounds to hold the flight. Inspectors moved toward the aircraft while ground staff calmly guided passengers back into the terminal. Connor attempted to slip out of the operations room to erase further records from the servers, but Grace Sullivan, the airline's chief counsel, noticed the odd movement and immediately ordered technology staff to lock every administrative account in the building. Grace had spent the better part of the morning quietly reviewing access logs, cross-checking them against the timestamps on the maintenance records Mason had already flagged. She had built her career on caution, on reading every contract twice and trusting nothing that hadn't been verified in writing, and that same caution was what allowed her to notice the small inconsistency that would later prove critical. She said nothing to Connor directly. Instead, she quietly informed the technology team to preserve every version of every file before anyone had the chance to alter them again. Mason was invited back inside, though now only as a witness providing information, not as an employee of the airline. He did not walk past Amelia with any sense of victory. Instead, his first request was that ground crews make sure every passenger received hotel rooms, meals, and a rebooked flight as quickly as possible. That single request unsettled Amelia more than anything he had said all day. She had assumed his only goal was to prove her wrong. Watching him now, she realized his attention had never once shifted away from the people who had been sitting on that aircraft. The first inspection results confirmed the worst of Mason's suspicions. The recently installed pressure sensor had not only skipped verification. Its serial number did not match anything on file. A technician named Jason Miller admitted, hands shaking, that Connor had personally instructed him to sign off on a procedure that had never actually been performed. Jason had complied out of fear of losing his job, but he had quietly kept a copy of the falsified work order, tucked away in case he ever needed proof of what had really happened. Amelia began to understand that Connor had been feeding her false information for longer than she wanted to admit. Samuel made it clear, however, that being deceived did not erase her responsibility. She had received a direct warning from Mason and chosen to ignore it anyway. Because Amelia held a commercial pilot's license and had used that authority to override an operations decision, the federal agency opened emergency proceedings to suspend it. Her own words in that conference room, once meant to sound powerful, now stood as evidence that the violation had been deliberate. The investigation soon widened to cover the airline's entire fleet. Mason worked alongside Grace and a team of federal inspectors, cross-referencing thousands of pages of maintenance history. What they found was a pattern stretching back nearly 2 years. Connor had been purchasing cut-rate components through a shell supplier he secretly owned a stake in, recording them as certified parts, splitting the profit difference with the supplier, pressuring technicians into signing falsified paperwork, and relying on an aggressive flight schedule to avoid the kind of deep inspection that might expose him. Investigators later learned that Connor had chosen his suppliers carefully, favoring companies just obscure enough to avoid drawing attention during routine audits, and structuring every transaction through layers of paperwork designed to look ordinary to anyone who wasn't looking closely. He had built relationships with a small circle of technicians over the years, some through genuine friendship and some through quiet financial favors, and he leaned on those relationships whenever a shortcut needed a signature. For a long time, the scheme worked precisely because nothing dramatic ever seemed to happen. Planes landed safely, schedules held. No one asked the kind of questions that might have unraveled it sooner. Flight 217 had been the most dangerous flight of all, because the counterfeit pressure sensor could send false readings to the aircraft's cabin pressurization system. If the plane had reached cruising altitude with that sensor in place, the system might have responded far too slowly to a real pressure loss, and the storm along the route could have left the crew almost no time to identify the true cause before it was too late. Mason never claimed the aircraft was guaranteed to crash. What frightened him most about aviation safety, he told Grace one evening, was never a single catastrophic failure. It was the quiet combination of small failures stacking on top of each other: a false sensor reading, a falsified record, a dangerous storm, a rushed decision made under pressure. Any one of those alone might mean nothing. Together, they could mean everything. Amelia read through the full technical analysis and understood, perhaps for the first time, that Mason had not simply protected the airline's reputation. He had likely saved the lives of everyone who would have been on that aircraft. Connor tried one more time to shift blame back onto Amelia, presenting investigators with a stack of emails showing she had repeatedly pushed for shorter maintenance windows and stricter on-time performance. Amelia did not deny it. She admitted, quietly and without excuse, that she had built a culture where employees were afraid to raise concerns. She had not known about the counterfeit parts, but the atmosphere she created had made it far easier for Connor to hide them. Mason had every opportunity to destroy Amelia publicly in that moment. Instead, he offered only the facts without adding speculation and without softening her mistakes to protect her. When Grace asked why he didn't seem interested in getting revenge on the woman who had fired him, Mason answered simply that the purpose of a safety investigation was never to find someone to hate. It was to make sure the same failure never happened again. Amelia overheard that answer from just outside the doorway. For the first time since the crisis began, her shame had nothing to do with losing power. It came from realizing she had completely misjudged the one person in the building who had never once lied to her. Knowing his arrest was close, Connor made one final move. He took an old email of Mason's and altered it carefully, crafting a version that made it look as though Mason had deliberately exaggerated the risks in order to seize control of the company for himself. The forged document leaked to the press within hours, and by the end of the day, Mason was being described across news segments as a bitter former investigator who had used the crisis to settle old scores. Several board members began calling for his removal from the investigation entirely. Meanwhile, Connor quietly prepared to leave the country on a private aircraft departing from a small regional airport, and before he left, he attempted to wipe the servers containing evidence of his financial arrangements with the parts supplier. Grace noticed something wrong with the leaked email almost immediately. Its internal timestamp formatting did not match the airline's actual messaging system, though she didn't yet have proof strong enough to expose the forgery outright. Mason went through the data himself and found the flaw Connor had overlooked. The fabricated email referenced a component code that had not been added to the system until 6 months after the message was supposedly sent. Amelia faced a decision that would define her far more than anything that had happened before. If she stayed silent, she could let Mason absorb the blame and use the moment to convince the board to restore her full authority. If she told the truth, she would have to publicly admit that she had personally ordered a dangerous aircraft into the sky. At an emergency press conference, Amelia set aside the statement her communications team had prepared for her. She confirmed in her own words that Mason's warning had been correct from the beginning. She admitted that she had fired him and had personally attempted to bypass the safety process. She also stated, clearly and without hesitation, that the email being used against him showed every sign of being falsified. Her admission caused the company's stock to fall even further, but it also destroyed whatever plan Connor had left. Samuel used the financial records Grace had uncovered to secure an arrest order, and federal agents intercepted Connor at the regional airport before his aircraft ever left the ground. Inside his luggage, they found a hard drive containing payment records, a hidden account, and a list of every employee who had been pressured into signing falsified inspection documents. Connor was charged with fraud, falsifying safety records, obstructing a federal investigation, and endangering the operation of a commercial aircraft. Amelia's own reckoning, however, was far from finished. A hearing to determine the fate of her pilot's license and her role at the company was scheduled for the following morning. The hearing took place in a plain federal conference room with fluorescent lighting and rows of folding chairs, a space that felt almost too ordinary for a decision that would determine the future of an entire airline. It was attended by Amelia, Mason, Grace, Samuel, and several members of the airline's board, along with a handful of federal attorneys who spoke in the measured, unhurried tone of people who had done this many times before and understood exactly how much weight their words carried. A federal attorney played the recording captured inside the operations room that day, and the entire room heard Amelia's voice as clearly as if she were saying the words again for the first time. "Fly it now, I'll pay the fine." Amelia did not deny it. She described the financial pressure she had been under, the manipulation she had suffered at Connor's hands, and the false data she had been given. But she never used any of it as an excuse. She acknowledged plainly that Mason had given her every reason she needed to delay that flight, and that she had chosen to ignore him anyway, out of fear of losing a contract and a need to prove her authority to the board. Federal representatives recommended a long suspension of her pilot's license, a permanent restriction from directly involving herself in operational safety decisions, placing Madison Atlantic Airways under special regulatory oversight, and requiring the entire leadership team to complete a comprehensive safety reform program. When Mason was called as a witness, many in the room expected him to ask for her license to be revoked permanently. Instead, he drew a careful distinction between two separate questions. He confirmed that Amelia's actions that day had been genuinely dangerous and deserved real consequences. But he also noted that she had not been part of the scheme involving the counterfeit parts, had admitted her mistakes publicly, and had provided evidence that helped bring Connor to justice. Mason recommended that Amelia be barred from the cockpit until she completed retraining, underwent an evaluation of her decision-making under pressure, and demonstrated in practice that she placed safety above profit. He was not asking for leniency. He was asking for a consequence that could actually change something, rather than one that simply destroyed a person for the sake of destroying her. The board's final decision was severe but measured. Amelia's pilot's license would be suspended. The airline's self-certification privileges would remain revoked until further notice. Amelia herself would lose the authority to order a flight to depart or to intervene in any safety decision. Operations could not fully resume until the entire fleet passed inspection, and going forward, an independent director of safety would hold absolute veto power over any flight, a power no executive at the company could override again. With a single phone call and the right evidence behind it, Mason had ended the very privilege Amelia once treated as something she was simply entitled to. After the hearing, Amelia asked him quietly why he hadn't tried to destroy her when he clearly had the chance. Mason told her he had never made that call to punish anyone. He had made it because 180 people were sitting on an aircraft that was not safe to fly. The answer stayed with Amelia long after she left the building. The difference between them, she realized, had never truly been about power. It was that Mason never forgot that every number in a safety report represented a real person. 3 weeks later, the entire fleet underwent inspection. More than 10 components failed to meet certification standards and were replaced before they ever endangered another flight. Madison Atlantic Airways absorbed significant financial losses in the process, but it avoided a disaster that could have unfolded months or years down the road. The board asked Mason to return as Director of Flight Safety, offering him a considerably higher salary. He agreed only after the contract guaranteed several conditions in writing. The safety department would operate independently of the finance division. No executive would ever again have the authority to override a technical hold. Employees who reported safety concerns would receive full protection from retaliation. Every warning would be logged in a system leadership could not access or alter, and executive bonuses would no longer be tied entirely to on-time performance. Amelia temporarily stepped down as chief executive and entered the safety reform program herself. She spent weeks working alongside ground crews, watching technicians examine every bolt, every wire, and every line of a maintenance log by hand. She learned the names of people she had only ever seen as line items in a budget report, men and women who had spent decades keeping aircraft safe without ever expecting recognition for it. One older mechanic, a woman named Carol who had worked the hangar floor for over 20 years, told Amelia plainly that executives came and went every few years chasing quarterly numbers. But the people on the floor were the ones who had to live with whatever those executives decided. For the first time in her career, Amelia understood the real distance between a decision made behind glass walls and the consequences carried by the workers standing out on the runway. She began arriving before sunrise, not because anyone required it of her, but because she wanted to see the airline the way Mason had always seen it, one inspection at a time, one honest report at a time. 6 months later, the federal agency scheduled a test flight for the very aircraft once assigned to Flight 217. No passengers were on board, only a test crew, inspectors, and a technical team monitoring every system. Amelia was not permitted to sit in the cockpit. She observed from the rear cabin as a trainee in the safety reform program, nothing more. Partway through the test, a warning system registered a small fluctuation. The pilot suggested continuing, since the readings still fell within acceptable limits. Amelia looked over the data and requested that the aircraft return to the airport for inspection instead. The decision cost the airline tens of thousands of dollars in additional testing. After landing, the technical team discovered a loose electrical connection, not dangerous during a short test flight, but the kind of flaw that could grow into a real hazard after repeated cycles of use. Mason realized, watching from the operations center, that Amelia had genuinely changed. She had not made that call to impress him. She had made it because she finally understood the principle he had spent his entire career defending. Samuel agreed to consider restoring part of Amelia's pilot's license once she completed every remaining requirement, though her authority to influence the airline's safety decisions would remain limited for the foreseeable future. Amelia accepted the terms without argument. A year later, Madison Atlantic Airways resumed full operations under an entirely new structure. The airline no longer led the industry in on-time performance, but it became known as one of the most transparent carriers when it came to reporting safety concerns. Mason built a new program he called One Voice Can Ground a Flight, giving any technician, flight attendant, or pilot the authority to stop a flight the moment they identified a real risk, without fear of retaliation from anyone above them. Jason Miller, the technician Connor had once pressured into signing falsified paperwork, was reinstated and became the airline's lead trainer in maintenance ethics for new employees. Grace was appointed to the airline's newly formed independent oversight board. Amelia returned to the company, though not with the unchecked authority she once held. She agreed that the safety board would carry veto power over every decision she made going forward. During a company-wide meeting, Amelia stood in front of the entire staff and offered Mason a public apology. She admitted she had mistaken his silence for weakness, his caution for fear, and power itself for genuine leadership. Mason had never asked her to apologize in front of anyone. Still, he accepted it because it sent a message every employee in that room needed to hear. No one at the company stood above the safety process, not even the woman whose name was on the building. Over time, the relationship between Mason and Amelia shifted from confrontation towards something closer to mutual respect. Any hint of deeper feelings stayed subtle, carried only in quiet conversations after long shifts, shared cups of coffee in the operations center, and the way Amelia slowly began asking him about the parts of his life that had nothing to do with the airline. Mason kept a careful professional distance. He had no interest in a relationship built on gratitude or guilt. Amelia understood that and never pushed. She told him only that whenever he felt she had truly become a different person, she would like to invite him to a dinner that had nothing to do with airplanes, shareholders, or federal investigations. Mason didn't agree right away, but for the first time since the whole ordeal began, he smiled at her. The story closes on the morning Madison Atlantic Airways officially relaunched its Denver to London route. The fully inspected aircraft sat waiting under the early sunlight, and the flight crew moved through every checklist without being rushed by a clock or pressured by cameras. Mason stood in the operations center, reviewing the weather data and technical records one final time. Amelia walked over and set the last approval form in front of him. Instead of signing it herself or issuing an order, she simply asked him a question. "Do you think it's ready?" Mason checked the numbers one more time and confirmed that every condition had been met. The aircraft took off without incident, its engines rising into a clear morning sky with none of the frantic energy that had surrounded Flight 217 a year earlier. There were no investors watching from a private lounge, no journalists counting down the minutes until departure, only a quiet runway and a crew that had been given all the time they needed. From the observation deck, Amelia watched it climb into the sky and admitted that she used to believe money could fix any consequence, no matter how serious. Mason answered quietly that money could cover a fine. It could never bring an aircraft back once it was already too late. That evening, Mason went home to a brief, quiet scene with Luke. The boy asked if his father had saved anyone that day. Mason told him he had simply done his job the way he always tried to. His phone buzzed with a message from Amelia inviting both father and son to the company's family day that weekend. Mason looked at Luke, who was already smiling at the idea, and agreed. The story ends with a simple truth carried through every scene that came before it. Real power was never the ability to force other people to follow an order. Real power was the courage to stop everything when everyone else was pushing forward. Amelia had once believed she could pay her way out of any mistake. Mason showed her that in aviation there were some prices no one, no matter how wealthy, could ever afford to pay.